Good morning. Well, we've jumped into chapter 3 now of Hebrews, and yesterday we just simply saw that one appeal of the writer, which was namely that we consider Jesus, that we gaze intently at Jesus, that we focus on him, that we cling to him. Well, I want to get into chapter 3 now, and I would tell you just by way of the beginning here, chapter 3 and 4 work together as one theme. They work together as one point. There really is sort of a text that works behind just 3 and 4. You see that text emerge down in verse 7 of chapter 3, and it runs 7 through 11, where the psalmist is quoting Psalm 95, 7 through 11, that today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray in their heart, and they did not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Now, the reference being made there was to the children of Israel who came out of Egypt under Moses. And when they were traveling through the wilderness, they began to grumble against God, and they came to the place where there was no water, and they began to complain that there was no water, and they grumbled against God, and they grumbled against Moses. And so God gave them water from a rock, you'll remember, but God ultimately pronounced judgment on these people and said they have a heart problem. Now, outwardly, their confession is fine. Outwardly, the ritual is fine. They'd all stood at Sinai, and in Exodus 19, they'd all declared, whatever the Lord says, we will do. They'd all said they were God's people, but ultimately God said these people have a heart problem. So it wasn't external, it was internal. And it was seen by the reality of how they responded to Moses. They didn't listen to Moses. They grumbled against him. They turned against him. I've often told people who aspire to leadership, especially those who aspire to Christian leadership, if you have set your heart on becoming an overseer, like Paul says in 1 Timothy 3, and you desire some sort of leadership role amongst God's people, which is a noble calling, but if you desire that, you ought to first go back and read the book of Numbers and see the perils of leadership. There was probably no leader in the Old Testament that should have been more revered and more followed and more loved than Moses. When you think back to all that Moses did as God's servant over the children of Israel, going into Egypt, well, first leaving the courts of Egypt, but then going back into Egypt, the 10 plagues God orchestrated through Moses, leading God's people out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, manna from heaven, all the things that Moses was used by God to do, and yet these people continually turned on him. Well, these people were testified about in Psalm 95 as the reality that God said, I swore in my wrath, they will not enter my rest. God says, I loathed that generation. Well, chapters 3 and 4 now are making a comparison of that generation to the current generation. This generation who is now not following Moses, but is following Christ, and who is debating, who is tempted to do the same thing to Christ that these children did to Moses. And the warning of the writer of Hebrews is, listen, if those people under Moses rebelled and grumbled against Moses, and as a result of that, they all died in the wilderness, God said they will not enter my rest. They never made it to the promised land. Let that be an illustration. Because if you do the same thing to Jesus that they did to Moses, you also won't enter God's rest. It's an Old Testament parable of sorts, application applied to today. And the application that goes a little further here is that if it's done to Moses and they didn't enter God's rest, how much worse when you do it to Jesus, right? And it's the same sort of point that he made earlier in the book when he said, if the law spoken through angels was unalterable, how much worse is it to reject the law or the teaching of Christ? Now, if to rebel against Moses brought the penalty of no rest, how much worse would it be to rebel against Christ? That's really the theme of chapters 3 and 4, and you'll see that over the coming days as we begin to walk our way through it. But we look now at the early parts of chapter 3, and what you get is a comparison between Jesus and Moses. Very interesting, because I want you to understand when we talk about Moses, we're talking about really one of the pinnacle leaders in the history of the Old Testament. Certainly Abraham has his high place as he is considered our father, but very few men in the Old Testament were revered like Moses was revered. Think about him for a second. Supernaturally protected at his birth, divinely and privately buried by God at his death. Moses, it says, spoke to God face to face. Moses had a closer encounter with the Lord than any other human in the Old Testament. If you go back to Exodus chapter 33, Exodus 33, What verse was that I was looking for? Exodus 33:11. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. If you look down to verses 17 and 19 of Exodus 33, the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and will show compassion on whom I will show compassion. Look, nobody else had that type of experience in the Old Testament but Moses. So when the writer of Hebrews brings up Moses, he is dealing with a very tense issue. Don't come up here and start bashing Moses. And the writer of Hebrews doesn't. In fact, he compares the faithfulness of Moses even to the faithfulness of Jesus. He says that Moses was faithful also, just like Christ was faithful. That's a pretty compelling application there, or comparison. But the point to be made is, if rebelling against Moses brought penalty, how much more to rebel against Jesus? So let's look at chapter 3. Therefore, holy brethren, and we talked about this yesterday, partakers of a heavenly calling, these who claim to be believers, consider Jesus, gaze on him, the apostle and high priest of our confession. Now, the confession in the Old Testament he refers to would be Exodus 33, or Exodus 19, where the children of Israel said, all that God has declared we will do. That was their confession. The apostle of their confession was Moses. He was the sent one of God who mediated out that truth. He was the one they were following. The high priest of their confession, however, was not Moses. It was Aaron. Aaron was their priest. But the writer of Hebrews says, in a startling contrast, Jesus for us is both. He is apostle, the sent one of God, and high priest, the interceder on our behalf. He is the apostle and high priest of our confession. Now, Jesus, in verse 2, was faithful to him, that is, faithful to God who appointed him, as Moses was also in all his house. So they were both faithful to God as servants of sorts. They were both faithful to do what they were called to do as apostles. Verse 3, for he, that's Jesus, has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So here's your first comparison. You have them both working in that office as apostle. Jesus is also working in the office of priest. But the writer of Hebrews now says, even though Moses was faithful, Jesus deserves more glory than Moses. Why? Because unlike Jesus, Moses did not build the house. Moses served over the house. Moses did not create the people of God. He did not redeem the people of God. He merely served the people that God was redeeming. God built the house, right? God put together those people. God saved Abraham. God called them to multitude like the stars of heaven. God delivered them from Egypt. But Moses was appointed a servant over that house. Jesus, however, is different. Not only does Jesus serve the house, but Jesus built the house. He was the redeemer of the house. He was the builder. He's the chief cornerstone. He's the foundation, right? He has more glory and honor. So what we're saying is, if you thought it was important to be a part of that congregation in Moses' day, even more so the congregation in Jesus' day. And Jesus has a higher role and ranking in his congregation even than Moses did in his. Okay, so we're just establishing right now that Jesus is greater than Moses. We love Moses. He was faithful, but Jesus is greater because unlike Moses, who served the house, Jesus built the house. In fact, look at verse 5. Now Moses was faithful. Says it again. Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are, if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. Moses was a servant. Christ is a son. Moses was actually part of the house he served. Christ built the house he was a son over. You see the difference? One last point I want to make to you this morning for you to carry with you. In verse 5, Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. Very important statement about Moses. You have all of these Jews from the Old Testament who revered Moses. You might remember back in John 9:29, the Pharisees even said, as for Moses, we know he spoke from God, but we don't know where this man came from. I mean, they revered and loved Moses. We are disciples of Moses, right? They said it all the time. Well, very important statement that the writer of Hebrews wants to give to these Jews who are debating leaving Christ and going back to, quote, Moses, the law. That's what they're thinking about doing because they know Moses was faithful. They know he was a servant of God. Very important thing. Jesus says, or the writer of Hebrews says about Moses, that Moses was faithful as a servant for, very important word, for a testimony of those things which were to be spoken later. Primary calling of Moses, to give testimony of what was coming later. Flip back for a moment over to John chapter 5, verse 45. John 5:45. In John 5:45, Jesus says, "Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." What's the writer of Hebrews pointing out? You cannot leave Jesus and go back to Moses, because if you leave Jesus, you're not just rejecting Jesus. Who else are you rejecting? Moses, because Moses wrote about Jesus. Moses pointed to Jesus. Moses served the congregation, the house of God. What's the house? Verse 6, he said, whose house we are. We're the house. It's the congregation of God. Moses was a servant of that house for what purpose? To get that house to look at Jesus. That's what he was trying to do. He was driving the people to Jesus. It's a fascinating study. Go back and read the books that Moses wrote. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And you know what you'll find in all those books? Overwhelming testimony that you need Jesus. It's all the gospel. It's Moses' gospel. And he drives you through everything. Sin in Adam, judgment in Noah, justification by faith in Abraham, and sovereign selection, right? Grace and a new life in Jacob, all the way in through the providence of God in Joseph and the line of Judah. You get sacrifice in Exodus. All these things, a prophet greater is coming in Deuteronomy. All of these are a picture of Jesus. That's who Moses was writing about. So the writer of Hebrews is very shrewd here. When he looks at these Jews who are contemplating leaving, and he says, listen, you can't leave Jesus and go back to Moses because Moses spoke about Jesus. You have to stick with Jesus, who's greater than Moses. And if there was a stiff penalty in rejecting Moses, how much greater the penalty in rejecting Jesus? And so the writer now says in verse 6, we are the house of God if we hold fast our confidence and the boast of our hope firm until the end. Hold fast is important there. You're going to see it all throughout chapter 3 and 4. That's the key. Hold on. Don't leave. Don't go. You can't reject Jesus and still be pleasing to God. You need to consider Jesus, not defect from him. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. But in the meantime, you have a great day in him.